Stuck at low stakes? These 3 mistakes could be holding you back. Every high stakes player knows about them, so make sure to watch till the end if you're trying to move up. Mistake number 1 is slow playing too much on dry boards. If you look at this flop of King 7 deuce, you'll see that big blind is playing very aggressively versus the c-bet. So hands like 2 pair sets, they're check raising almost all the time. And if you haven't done a lot of study with solvers, this can seem a little bit strange because the board is so dry and there's no draws or anything to be protecting against. So 10, 15 years ago, what everyone was doing was just slow playing, sevens, deuces on this kind of board because, at the end of the day, why do we need to fold out hands like Queen 9 and Jack 9? Right? It feels a lot more natural to just call and keep these hands in your opponent's range. But of course, nowadays with solvers, we know that this is a mistake. Right? And the main reason why solvers don't like slow playing is because when you look at the composition of Button's c-betting range, it's actually a very depolarized range. There's a ton of hands like 9s, 10s, jacks, a lot of 7x as well. And if you think about what all of these hands are going to do on the turn, they're really just going to check behind and try and get to showdown. So let's take a look at a random turn, like the 6 of spades, for example. So what Button is going to do with all of these weak 1-pair hands, right, is just check behind the turn almost all the time. Right? And even hands like weak top pair, King 4, King 5, that they're also checking all the time. And this is really the main problem with slow playing, which is that you're allowing all of these hands to just do exactly what they want, right? They're just making this small bet on the flop, hoping that you'll just call, and then when you do call, they're just going to check back the turn and bluff catch the river in a very small pot. So the only way to spoil our opponent's plan is to go for the check raise right away. Because if we don't do it now, then we're probably not going to get the chance to do so on a later street. But that's it. I also work with a lot of low stakes players, and the main objection that they usually have is, what if my opponent is overfolding versus a check raise? The solver might be calling really wide. Right here you can see it's calling every single pair. It's even floating a bunch of backdoor type hands, right? Jack 9, 10, 9 with a backdoor. But surely we can't expect our opponent to be calling this wide in practice. But here's the thing. Even if our opponent was overfolding, the solution is not to start slow playing with our strong hands. Right? We still want to check raise our strong hands, but on top of that, we also check raise a whole load of bluffs to the point where our opponent is forced to pay us off with all of his weak bluff catchers. So that's kind of what the solver is doing here. You can see it's check raising a lot of random hands, backdoor type hands, 5-6, 4-5, even a little bit of like ace-5 offsuit as well. And the whole point of doing this is so that Button is forced to pay us off with his bluff catchers. And in fact, if you have enough of these bluffs, then it doesn't even matter whether the Button calls or folds. Right? So let's say if he calls with a hand like pocket 3s or 4s, then that's fine. Your 2 pairs and sets are generating a lot of EV, preventing all these hands from just checking back on the turn. If 3s and 4s start to fold, then of course your value hands are going to lose a bunch of EV, but that's fine because every dollar that your sets and 2 pairs lose is going to be recouped by all of these backdoor type bluffs that you are check raising. So as long as we have enough bluffs, it's not really a problem even if our opponent overfolds. Right? The EV of your entire range will still be very decent. Mistake number 2 is not betting big enough when your opponent is capped. So let's take a look at the same King 7 deuce rainbow board. And let's say if we make a small c-bet on the flop, our opponent calls, and the turn is the 10 of spades. So clearly, the only size that the solver is using is the overbet. And this is something that you don't see very often at lower stakes. I think a lot of players will just go for a more standard size like 2/3 or 3/4. And it's actually quite understandable, when you look at the turn like the 10 of spades, let's say if you have a hand like ace king, right? It's very normal to get a bit worried. What if my opponent hits 2 pair, he's going to have some king 10 offsuit, 10-7 suited. And when you go for such a large size, it can sometimes feel like your opponent is folding most of the hands that you beat, and that you're only getting called by the stuff that beats you. But it's important to still be objective here and to understand that the proportion of 2 pair plus in your opponent's range is actually not that large. Right? Big blind is going to have about 3 or 4% 2 pair. And it doesn't really make sense to start sizing down, just because you're afraid of running into 3% of 2 pair, and as a result, end up losing a ton of value against all of the other hands that you beat. At the end of the day, big bets simply make more money. Your opponent might fold a little bit more when you overbet, but it doesn't really matter because the one time that he calls, you're going to win such a massive pot that it just makes up for the rest of the times that he ends up folding. So of course, the usual counter argument once again is, what if my opponent is overfolding versus the overbet, right? But to be honest, even in that case, it doesn't necessarily mean that we want to size down, right? Because the overbet naturally generates more EV than the small bet. So there's actually a little bit of margin for error here, where we can accept like a little bit of overfolding the times that we overbet, and the overbet is still going to be higher EV compared to betting small. And in the first place, it's not even that clear if people are overfolding versus the overbet, right? I think there is probably some overfold, but not as much as what most people imagine. So we can use the solver to get a good idea of what we're supposed to be defending in theory. So versus 1.25, you can see big blind is going to call all of his top pair, which I think is pretty realistic. I don't think anyone is folding top pair on the turn. It's going to be calling a bunch of 10x, ace 10, queen 10 that might have floated the flop, right? So these hands, yeah, maybe it's not that realistic, to expect your opponent to be floating something like queen 10, jack 10. Even if he does call these hands, it's debatable in terms of whether or not they're going to call again on the turn. So yeah, like I said, there's probably going to be a little bit of overfold, right? But, besides 10x, if you look at the rest of these weak pairs and stuff like ace high, right, most of them are actually combos with the flush draw. Their hands like queen 7 of spades, queen deuce of spades, stuff like ace 9, ace 8 of spades. And, I don't think anyone is going to be folding like some kind of pair flush draw on the turn, even if you go for a small overbet, right? This is just 1.25, it's not like some kind of massive 2x pot overbet. So to my eyes, this still looks like quite a realistic calling range, right? And on top of that, even if there is some amount of overfold, you also have to consider that the small bet might also be overfolded. So let's look at the response versus a half pot bet, right? So look at hands like, let's say 7x, right? 7x is basically supposed to call all the time, right? And your opponent is also supposed to call the majority of his deuce X, right? He's supposed to be, floating a bunch of hands like, ace jack here is calling all the time. So I think regardless of whether we bet big or small, there is still going to be some amount of overfold, right? So just because the overbet specifically is overfolded, it really doesn't justify sizing down. First of all, because the overbet is naturally more profitable to begin with. And secondly, because the small bet is probably also going to be overfolded. The last mistake is not betting enough with low equity hands. So if we go along with the same board of King 7 deuce 10, you'll see that button is not just betting the turn with hands like flush draws and open-enders. There's also a bunch of very weak bluffs like gut shots, and even hands like ace 5, ace 6, queen 4, queen 5, hands that barely have any equity at all. They're also betting the turn quite often. And this is something that you guys are definitely not doing enough. So in terms of the theoretical reason why these hands get bet, it's really just about giving our opponent a bit more incentive to pay off our value, right? Because can you imagine if your overbet range was just top pairs, over pairs, straight draws, flush draws, your opponent could actually just start folding all of the hands that are indifferent. So pretty much all of the 7x. He's definitely not going to call, with hands like ace jack as well. And on top of that, he can also start fast playing the very top of his range, right? So hands like king 10, 10, 7, they can just start raising all the time, because previously does make a bit of sense to slow play and keep in all of the trash that you're betting on the turn, right? But now that your betting range is just like top pair plus and a bunch of straight draws and flush draws, it becomes very nice to check raise a hand like 10-7 just to deny all of that equity. And this is something that you can consider doing in practice as well, right? If you think that your opponent is betting a bit too equity driven of a range, if he's missing all of these cut shots and pure air hands, then that's what you actually want to do as the big blind. And likewise, if you are on the button and you think that your opponent is capable of making that same adjustment, then it becomes very important to be able to find some of these bluffs. And when it comes to bluff selection, you have to understand that we're not trying to play 100% balance. All we have to do is to try and find some of the most obvious bluffs, right? Just to give off the illusion of being balanced. So for example, on any kind of rainbow board, let's say here if the turn is a spade, then of course any hand with a spade is going to make a pretty good bluff, right? You're blocking a lot of the backdoor flush draw floats that have now turned a flush draw and will probably continue versus your turn bet, right? So if we filter for hands with one spade, you can see Queen 9, Jack 8, Ace 4, Ace 5, they're betting almost all the time. So as long as you show up with these hands once in a while, right, your opponent is very unlikely, to be exploiting you in all these ways that we mentioned earlier. It's a little bit like how some animals, right, some snakes, they have these colorful patterns on their skin and they look really poisonous, but in reality, they're not, right? They're kind of just piggybacking on all of the other poisonous snakes, and this gives them some kind of adaptive advantage because they don't have to spend all of these like resources being poisonous themselves. So that's kind of what we want to do as well. Just focus on the really easy stuff, right? Just bet all these offsuit hands with a spade, very easy strategy to execute. And then the more complex stuff, right? All of these Queen 4, Queen 5s, 8, 6, 4, 5 with no spade, a little bit harder to understand, like which hands have, better properties for betting. So with these hands, it doesn't matter so much what you do. I wouldn't be trying to get them exactly correct, right? If you really wanted to, you could maybe just like mix it up with an RNG, or even better, if you have some kind of population data, you can just pick the line that you think works the best in practice. And one last thing to take note of is that let's say if the flop is two-tone instead of rainbow, then this heuristic of barreling hands with a spade, it doesn't always work so well, right? So for example, on this 9-7-3 two-tone board, let's say if button C bets, big blind calls, and the turn is a blank, right? So in this case, we can actually see that most of the high card hands, it's still pretty nice, to have king of spades, queen of spades, right? These hands clearly have a preference for betting over the non-spade combos. But looking at some of these ace-x hands, it's actually not super clear that we want to be betting with the ace of spades especially, and that's because if you think about big blind's calling range on the flop, it's going to contain a lot of these ace-jack and ace-10 floats, and because the flop is two-tone, opponent is specifically floating the combos that have the ace of spades. And of course, what ends up happening when you barrel the turn is that all of these hands are just going to fold, right? So in that sense, it's not really ideal to be having the ace of spades, but king of spades, queen of spades, it's a little bit more acceptable, right? Because opponent would not be floating, king jack, queen jack offsuit on the flop. So what I'll do in this case is just make sure that I show up with all of this king high, queen high with a spade once in a while. And here, because this trade also completes on the turn, you can see the solver loves barreling with hands like 5x and 6x, right? They have pretty good blockers, even a little bit of backup equity. So these are the hands that you want to be finding, right? Remember, just always focus on the easy part of the strategy. And then, the rest of the stuff that is kind of just mixing it up, queen deuce, king deuce, doesn't really matter whether you bet these hands or not, as long as your opponent is playing a reasonable strategy and is not specifically trying to exploit the fact that you're under bluffing. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, and you can also check out my channel, Poker Giraffe, for more strategy content.